It's my great honour to welcome our next panellist. He is a human rights and prisons expert. He's based in Colombia and he's a former board member of the Irish Penal Reform Trust. He's been openly critical of the Irish policy of housing males who identify as female in with women in the women's estate. It's my great honour to introduce GEARÓID O'LOINGSIGH. GEARÓID, how are you?
Okay.
Great to have you here with us today, all the way from Bogotá. Have I said that correctly? How did you say it to me earlier? Bogotá, was it?
Yeah.
I think that's beyond me. GEARÓID, it's great to have you here, and we're always so interested to hear your perspective as someone who kind of views this through the lens of prison reform, the historical context of prison reform, and also the geographical context of prisons, you know, all around the world and in the global, including the global south. So I'll start off by asking you, you know, up until recently, it was just a given that if a man was a convicted rapist, or if he was charged with rape but on remand, or if he had a stated intention to murder and rape women, all of those men would have been housed in prison to keep women safe. They would have been separated from women and from society in order to keep women safe. But as we go out here live today, those three cases are currently being housed in the female estate, locked in with women in Ireland, in the upside down, as I call it. How did you first become aware of this policy?
Well, I was a bit taken back by surprise. I mean, when the whole trans issue first cropped up, well, on my radar was when Germaine Greer was no platformed, and it just seemed like something that was, you know, far away, academic, in a university, an extension of that intolerant wave sweeping across US campuses, where debates are reduced to who was the most offended person in the audience. And it didn't seem like something that was real, that would have an impact on social policy. And then is jailed and put into the women's prison. And I sort of thought at the time, well, surely the Penal Reform Trust would have something to say about this, because I'd been on its board, you know, back 2004 to 2005, just before I moved back out to Colombia. And they did actually have something to say about it. It was just not what I was expecting them to say, because it went against everything that they'd been saying for years, not just them, penal reform organizations right around the world. The whole idea, the demands of penal reform organizations center around making prisons, for example, safer for all inmates. And all inmates includes women. In fact, you know, one of the great advances in prison reform was the idea that you would separate prisoners by sex, between men and women, and from children. And this is not a new idea. This goes right back to the late 1700s. That's how far back we're slipping on the issue, that, you know, you would separate people according to certain categories. And this was done out of a concern for protection, men in relation to women and adults in relation to children. And even nowadays, there are jurisdictions where even amongst the adult population, they distinguish between young adults, 18 to 21-year-olds, for example, and older adults, again, with this whole concern around protecting people who are in custody. There are people who are in a vulnerable situation. So I sort of thought, well, the logical thing would be that the Penal Reform Trust would say, hey, hold on a minute, we can't do this, right? And what I found was, not only did they agree with going to Limerick prison, in 2016, they came up with a report that basically advocated that. And it was quite surprising, and the report itself is called Out on the Inside. It's really, really disappointing. And it does something which sort of like seems to be standard now in all discussions around trans issues, is you mix the issue of transgenders with lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. So when you read the Penal Reform Trust's report, lesbian, gays, and bisexuals are in there, they're all over the place. And then suddenly, on the tail end, the trans prisoner is brought in, and everything you've said prior to that is used as a justification in relation to some particular policy on trans issues. Now, lesbian, gay, and bisexuals in prison has always been, or has long been, an issue of concern for people interested in penal reform. Either because in some countries, being gay in and of itself is a criminal offence, or having a gay relationship, same-sex relationship, is a criminal offence. And they would have, prison organisations would have argued, obviously, for the decriminalisation, the legalisation of gay relationships, etc. And then there were problems for gay prisoners within the prison, either due to victimisation from prison staff or victimisation from other prisoners. So this has always been an issue of concern. What was new about the Penal Reform Trust was how they latched on the issue of transgender prisoners onto that. And they were actually very, very dishonest in the way they did it and what they had to say about them.
I actually read that report, and I remember feeling sick to my stomach, actually, because I remember, I'll never forget it. They put, in terms of, they were kind of ranking prisoners in terms of vulnerability, who was the most vulnerable. And they had trans-identified males as more vulnerable than mothers and even pregnant women. I think that says all you need to know about the capture of that institution.
Well, you see, one of the things about when you look at the debates around prison issues and trans prisoners, some of these organisations, no, not all prison reform organisations have swallowed the Kool-Aid. You have to be clear about that, right? The Penal Reform Trust has. But you get an idea from prisons that prisons are dangerous places for transgender prisoners, and are sort of okay for everybody else.
Yeah.
Prisons are actually terrible places to be in, right? You know, prisons are not nice places. They're not good for your physical health, your mental health. And most of them are actually pretty horrible physically. I mean, as part of my work here in Colombia, until the pandemic kicked in, I was going in and out of the major prison here, one of the two major prisons here in Bogotá. I was going in and out of every 3 weeks. We're doing workshops, and I've been to other prisons. And no prison is really, you know, the nicest prison I've ever been inside of is the Docas unit in Ireland. Yeah? Every other prison, they're horrible places. They're not nice, and they're dangerous. But they're dangerous for every prisoner. And what the Penal Reform Trust did in the report is ignore that and talked about prisons in terms of how vulnerable trans prisoners were. And they used, I mean, some of the things they say about prisons in the report are actually true, but they're true for all prisoners. You know, I mean, one of the things that, one of the reasons that they give for housing Barbie Kardashian and people like him in a women's prison is the danger of sexual violence, right, in prisons. So, you know, and people who don't work on prison issues could be forgiven for making a whole load of assumptions and mistakes in relation to sexual violence in prisons, partly due to Hollywood films and stuff like that, you know, popular myths. But actually, most rapes in prison are committed by heterosexual males against other heterosexual males. That's one of the first points that we cannot lose sight of, you know, that, you know, sexual violence in prison is a lot like sexual violence outside of prison. It's about power. Whereas they reduce it to, oh, you know, they look like women, therefore they're going to be more prone to sexual violence. And that's actually just not the case. And rape in prison is frequently as well, and the Irish Penal Reform Trust knows this. It's frequently meted out as a punishment for, you know, infringing some rule, getting on the wrong side of somebody, or also for a drug debt. Somebody who owes money to somebody in jail and doesn't pay. Well, what are you going to do with that person? How are you going to enforce your will within prison? One of the most demeaning ways you can do that is obviously sexual violence. They just ignore this. And like I say, people on the who don't work on the issue could be forgiven for not realizing that. But the Penal Reform Trust, if it is anything, it is an authoritative organization with a wealth of information at its fingertips. It didn't make a mistake on this issue. It threw the issue of prison reform under a bus. You know, and the other thing they said, and this was sort of amazing, they said that, oh, well, you know, transgender inmates in communal showers, they would you know, be unwanted attention depending on their physical attributes. Now, let's remember, most trans never get operated in any sense of form. But, you know, Barbie Kardashian in a communal shower in Limerick prison, exactly how much unwanted or undesired attention would that generate? And it's also part of a myth that sexual assaults in prison are primarily in showers. This is part of the Hollywood narrative. It's not actually true. And again, the Penal Reform Trust knows this. Stats in Britain indicate that 4% of all sexual assaults, 7% of actual rapes occur in the showers and toilet facilities. The rest occur in the cell. The cell is the most dangerous place to be in a prison. And that's got to do with overcrowding. So instead of demanding an end to doubling up or even tripling up in cells, they decided, no, what we got to do is shift out these trans prisoners to a women's prison.
And obviously they're taking single cells each. So they are creating more overcrowding for the women, as well as the psychological impact of their presence on the women. You've done some writing for us for our blog, for the Countess blog, and what really struck me was when you talked about, you know, because of your work with male prisoners, you can say with absolute authority about all the different populations that are vulnerable within the male estate. So can you tell me, you know, what tends to happen to them and why trans-identified males are treated differently? You know, you've said before, like, they don't get moved into the female estate. So can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, there's all sorts of prisoners are vulnerable. I mean, for starts off, you know, openly gay prisoners, and the Penal Reform Trust sort of acknowledge this, and they latch the trans onto. Openly gay prisoners are just as vulnerable. Nobody would ever say that a gay man should be in a women's prison. It wouldn't. Not only would it not occur to the prison authorities, it wouldn't occur to the gay man to demand that they be transferred to a women's prison. Now, women's prisons tend to be smaller, and because they're smaller, they're safer, right? And also, the type of prisoner who's in a women's prison tends to be less violent, convicted of less violent crimes. Not to say that there are no.
Only 5% though. Only 5% are violent. You know.
But it depends on the jurisdiction. You know.
Yeah, but in Ireland, 95% it's just petty criminals, addiction, poverty.
But even here, for example, you know, Colombia has a really high homicide rate. Over 20,000 men are in prison for homicide. It's only 746 women are currently serving a sentence for homicide at the moment. And that's actually one of the things about the Irish prison system. You know, when we're making decisions, and Fiona spoke about this just before, you know, you need stats for policy. I can go onto the Colombian prison system's website now and pull up the stats and tell you how many people are currently in jail for a whole host of crimes. I can tell you by the crime. Yeah, you can't do that in Ireland. You know, they don't know. They have no reliable stats of any nature, which is why actually, you know, in the article that I wrote for the Countess website, I actually used British stats because they're comparable prison systems, but the Irish prison system just doesn't have the statistics there for that. But going back to your question about who's vulnerable, everybody's vulnerable in prison. The only people that are not vulnerable or are less vulnerable will be leaders of gangs, but even they run certain risks of violence. But in terms of, for example, in the United States, the US tends to produce from time to time fairly good prison report with good stats. So what do we know? We know that if you have a mental health problem, you're 2.5 times more like in youth facilities, for example. You're 2.5 times more likely to be victim of a sexual assault than if you don't have a mental health problem. If you have a physical disability, you're 1.5 times more likely to be a victim of a sexual assault than if you don't. So, you know, this idea that trans are the most vulnerable is just nonsense. Now, trans prisoners can also have mental health problems. Trans prisoners can also have physical disabilities. Right? They're part of that cohort, but they're actually a small percentage of the overall population outside of the prison, and they're just a small, and even in some cases, smaller percentage of the prison population. And the idea that you would change prison policy for such a small number of people, but you wouldn't change it for people who have mental health problems and physical disabilities. And it's been a long time demand of penal reformers that people with mental health problems should be housed in facilities that can deal with that. And a prison is not the ideal place for that. They missed an opportunity to make an argument for a different type of prison system.
And the Department of Justice in Ireland, with regard to this policy, you know, talks about balancing the needs of trans-identified males with women, but we would argue there's no way to balance those needs. That they should not ever be housed in the women's estate. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I say, it goes back to this idea, which is a couple of centuries old, of separating men from women for the protection and well-being of women. Yeah. This is a basic idea, right? Which was not always the case. You know, women, even though this idea is a couple of centuries old, it's really in the 20th century that we begin to see this fully implemented in Europe, United States, and Canada. Where you get this segregation, and you get separation into individual cells, which was also, it was a new idea back 200 years ago. It was an invention, and it was done for the primary protection and well-being of the prisoner. And that's not the case anymore. We have, for example, there are lots of jurisdictions where prisoners are housed in barracks-like conditions. Or even here, we have, like the prison that I go into here, cells are designed for double occupancy. It's not doubling up. They're actually, that's the design. So there's no way you should be putting a man into such situations. And again, the primary concern is the protection of the prisoner. So what do you do with vulnerable prisoners in the male estate, for example? Well, there are wings in prisons for that. You know, sex offenders, for example, tend to be victims of violence from other prisoners. Right? There are particularly vulnerable cohorts within the prison population. So what happens to sex offenders? Well, sex offenders tend to be segregated from the rest of the prison population, which is not the same as solitary confinement. Solitary confinement, and it's important because I've seen this in part of the debate around what to do with trans prisoners. I've seen people saying, oh, well, lock them up in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement for more is it's transitory. It's either meant as a punishment or as a temporary measure for protection. The United Nations has defined solitary confinement over and above 15 days as torture. But segregation by category, that's not the same as solitary confinement. Not only can you do it, the Mandela principles on prisons allow for it. Explicitly, you can do this, you can segregate, and in fact, you should segregate prisoners by category. We're supposed to segregate prisoners by sex, by age, between sentenced prisoners and remand prisoners, which doesn't happen in Ireland. They're mixed in various jails. And you're also supposed to separate violent prisoners from non-violent prisoners, which doesn't necessarily mean a prisoner convicted of a violent offense. You might be convicted of white-collar crime, fraud, banking fraud or something, but you might actually be a very violent prisoner. And if you're identified as such, well, then you get moved out from a wing where you are with prisoners who are not violent. That's what you're supposed to do. It's called prison policy.
And in terms of what you've alluded to there, the different ways to separate, you know, different factions or gang members as well, you know.
All the time.
Like the arrangement at the moment that is in place in Limerick is that those males who are, as we've said and as we all know, both violent and they're all sex offenders. Well, 2 out of the 3 that we know about are sex offenders, and the third is violent. So they will have an arrangement in place where at any moment when they leave their cell, they have 2 prison staff with them at all times. Now we see very clearly that this is not scalable. You know, this cannot be scaled out for what will likely be more and more men, criminals who see that, you know, they would prefer to serve their time in the female estate. Like what Fiona said, you know, there is lots of research in England whereby a huge number of English men were identifying as Jewish in order to get better food. I mean, we would be very naive if we didn't think that criminals would do that. But if that aside, whether or not their intentions are innocent or not, how do you feel about the security arrangement that's in place? And is there couldn't that just be done in the male estate? There's no reason to stop them putting trans-identified males in Mountjoy and just creating the same arrangements there?
Well, it is done in the male estate. Particularly vulnerable prisoners or particularly violent prisoners. The prison authorities take greater care. I know from an experience with a prisoner in Jersey, actually, that they had 2 prison officers accompanying them around the male estate all of the time. You know, these type of things happen. The standard procedure, there is absolutely no need to put them into a women's prison. But when you're talking about the scalable thing, well, okay, we have 3 prisoners, so we can put 2 prison guards on them in the female estate. What do you do when the number of prisoners gets to 50 or 60 or 100? And given that Limerick prison actually has it's not even a women's prison, it's a section within a prison. What do you do when the numbers get to that scale? The same goes with the DOCAS unit, and it's interesting, of course, that they weren't put into the DOCAS unit, because the way the DOCAS unit is designed, it'd be really, really difficult to protect women from a male prisoner. The DOCAS unit was actually, when it was built, it was considered state of the art. It's actually, in its design and its concept, it's actually very progressive in terms of prison design and prison policy. If you were to put a man in there, because they're in houses, and the prisoners have huge amount of freedom, relative freedom, compared to other prisoners to move around that house and to move around the courtyard. It just couldn't be done. And, you know,
sorry to interrupt you there, but you know, we do know that the first male who was sent to the female state, the first trans-identified male, was indeed sent to Docus in the first instance. And that is the same person who is now appealing their sentence on grounds of leniency. So the details of their case have now come out, and they were convicted. We always knew it was 10 counts of sexual offences, but it wasn't clear, and 1 count of child cruelty. And by joining the dots, maybe it was possible to guess that that was with the same person, but it turns out they were abusing their stepson for years. So I think it's very chilling for all of us here today to be reminded that that person was put in Docus in the first instance. I mean, that is how much of a nightmare this policy is for women and for children, because that person is obviously a predator and a paedophile.
Yeah, and you know, and to go back again to the Penal Reform Trust, one of the things that's always argued, there are various sex offender programs in prisons right throughout the world. You know, quite a lot of sex offenders don't take part in them. Yeah, they're not, they're generally not obligatory anywhere. But if you have a sex offender who says they're a woman when they're a man, how do you do a sex offender program? Well, part of these programs is about recognizing what you did. Right? You have to, you know, you have to take ownership of what you did and own up to it and acknowledge it. How do you do that? If you're a man who raped a woman, how do you do that when you're saying, no, I'm a woman? You know, it undermines any of the measures that are there, you know, and it also undermines preventative measures outside of prison, you know, because there are programs in various parts of the world that try to identify people who are at risk of, particularly with children, yeah, risk of sexual violence or at risk of committing sexual violence. But you have to be able to talk about the reality of that crime in order to deal with it. And all those programs go out the window in a prison context if you are pretending that the sex offender concerned is a woman and not a man.
We're also concerned about the rights of the female staff in the female estate. You're probably aware, I mean, it was in the papers that there was a sort of a standoff recently in Limerick whereby a trans-identified male prisoner was thought to be carrying a weapon, a concealed weapon. And what happened was the male staff went to search him, and they couldn't because they identify as female, and the female staff couldn't because obviously, like 95% of trans-identified males, they had a fully intact male body. So nobody actually searched that male body, and they did some kind of screening process instead. So that's obviously a breach of security, and it's not feasible long term. But our concern as an advocacy group for women would very much be a serious concern that those female guards will be forced to search those male bodies. If you look at other jurisdictions like Scotland, their actually female prison staff went on strike, but then the guidelines came down and they were forced to search the men whose preferred gender was female. So that is a great concern for us, and we would view that as a breach of the human rights of those prison staff.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, you know, there's an actual former governor or governess of a prison in Scotland who's been quite vocal on this issue. One of the things that she pointed out, you know, when you go into prison,
Rona Hotchkiss, yeah.
Yeah, one of the first things that happens when you go into prison, and this is universal, is you're strip searched. Right now, you're strip searched normally by staff who are the same sex as you are. That's the norm. And in the Doka's unit, for example, and I've seen I was in when I did a report years ago, I was brought around and shown it, you know, the male staff are not actually able to see what's going on there at the gate. There are some male staff in the prison, not many, but a lot of them are on the gate and security and that. They're not able to see this, you know, there is a minimal protection given to what is a traumatic experience. And this governor, she said, you know, it's a really traumatic experience. So what happens if it's a man that's been strip searched by a woman? But she actually pointed to something which is even more dangerous, I will think, right? That someday there will be a prison officer who identifies, a male prison officer who identifies as female, and he will be allowed to strip search young, vulnerable women coming into the prison, right? And everything that we know about their vulnerability, the mental health problems, Fiona spoke about, you know, a lot of female prisoners have already experienced sexual assault prior to going to a prison. And you go in then, and you're now going to be searched by a prison officer who's a man.
And actually, with that in mind, you're writing and research into Californian jails, where, you know, it's obviously an industry really out there, and prisons, people are imprisoned on an industrial scale. You're talking about a huge population. That's one of the things that has come to light from your research, that a huge amount of sexual abuse is happening at the hands of prison staff in those jurisdictions.
Yeah, I mean, the United States, and this is what the other part of this, honestly, the Penal Reform Trust. The United States is unique in terms of prisons, in terms of the scale of violence, the level of violence. So when you quote figures about the United States, you do actually have to put that caveat in that you're talking about an exceptionally violent prison complex. But it is indicative, you know, that in the United States, according to RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, they compile stats on on sexual assault and rape in general, not just on prisons. And most of the stats have nothing to do with prisons per se. But what they've found is that 60% of sexual assaults and rapes in prisons are committed by staff, which is unusual. That wouldn't be the case in Ireland or Britain. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that no rapes in Britain or Ireland are committed by staff, because that is also clearly not the case. So, you know, you have a situation then, and also with the youth facilities, quite a high number of youths who are in youth detention facilities are sexually abused by staff members. You know, it's a common problem there. And it does exist, albeit to a lesser degree. We're not at the scale of the United States. Nowhere is at the scale of the United States in many aspects of prisons, but it does exist. So if you have a male officer entitled to strip search and to pat down, let's remember this, a female prisoner, the opportunities for abuse they're enormous, they're widespread.
The abuse might even happen in plain sight and not be obvious as well, because if you're talking about searching cavities or, you know, I mean, it's just a nightmarish vision, actually, I think, for all of us. I just wanted to ask you one last question. Sorry?
Even just a general leering at a woman who's stripping naked, doesn't actually have to physically touch her ever. For, you know, it's a form of abuse.
Yeah, I completely agree. GEARÓID, you have written for us, and I want to remind everyone here that your paper on the Californian prison system will be available on our blog, on our new website next week. We look forward to reading that and publishing that for you. My last question is, and to do with your writing that you do for us, you've told me that before you sent me, you know, the manuscript, you considered whether or not you should put your own name to it. And And that was remarkable because of all your decades of work with, you know, FARC rebels and gangs in one of the most dangerous countries in the world. So can you tell me a bit more about that? About your hesitancy to put your name to that piece of work?
Well, I've written so far 6 books on my own authorship on the Colombian conflict, and I've contributed chapters to other books. And I've done reports on prisons here, which are unfortunately only available in Spanish. And I've written lots of articles. Even actually in one of my books, I named a leading politician here, Juan Jose Chavez, as the intellectual author, the man behind the murder of a journalist. Now, he's never been charged with that murder. He's never even been investigated for it. So it was quite daring to sort of suggest that he might be the culprit. My name's on the book. And in fact, the family of the journalist scanned that copy of the book and they sent it to the head of the police and said, look what this journalist has said. Why are you not investigating this politician? Never ever occurred to me never to put my name to a text here, ever, not once. But when I wrote the first document on the whole trans issue, I was kind of thinking, should I use a pseudonym? Should I just put it out there without a name? Now, I discounted the idea. But the fact was, it actually went through my head. And the article that you're going to put up on the California, that was actually published in Spanish here first. And it's the only time it's on a website that I write for on a fairly regular basis. And the only time the editor of that website, anyone ever rang him to say, you should take that article down. I've written all sorts of stuff. I like to think my articles are good, but I'm sure some of them are not up to scratch and maybe should be taken down. This is the only thing someone has actually said, get rid of this article. He stood his ground and said no. And he said, but I will give you a right of reply, which he did. The right of reply said that they were going to deal with my arguments and not insult me, and then proceeded just to insult me that I was white, I was male, I was cisgender, heteronormative, and a whole range of other things. And sort of thought, oh, these people, they seem to know me better than I know myself, right? You know, that was the first time that's ever happened.
It's incredibly telling, isn't it? You know, the theme of this conference is resisting captivity, and that one anecdote of yours encapsulates perfectly what we talk about when we talk about captivity, that people feel cowed into submission and into groupthink around the dominant narrative. I just want to commend you so much for your bravery and integrity in speaking out, particularly as a former board member of the Irish Penal Reform Trust. Without doubt, there are other people in your cohort who feel the same way, but just feel unable to speak out. So we need people like you to do this, because without doubt, a critical mass will grow and things will change. Because after all, we live in a democracy. You know, we own this country, and these changes have been made in our names, but without our, you know, we weren't consulted. So thank you so much from all of us here today for your bravery and for a great chat, as ever.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I'm going to presume that if I move back to Ireland, the job with the Penal Reform Trust is off the cards.
Possibly, but hopefully by then everyone will have seen sense. If you want to put your the names of your books and your papers in the chat, and then the Countess team can tell people, because we're getting a lot of questions about your work. So if you want to type in.
The books are all in Spanish. There are articles in English, but the books are all in Spanish.
Well, maybe the articles, but we will be posting GEARÓID's article soon, and his research into California, where they've just mixed their jails. Thank you so much.
Jails here, by the way, are not mixed. Jails here are separate, yeah, and that's been the policy, and it's likely to continue to be the policy for the foreseeable future.
Is this in Colombia? Yeah.
Even though you can change sex here legally, even since 2018, you can now redefine yourself as a woman should you see fit. and which has led to, there was one woman in jail for femicide.
So there actually are systems where self-ID or a form of self-ID exists, but where those males who feel they are female or identify as female are not placed in the female estate. So there are models out there.
Only 4 countries in Latin America don't allow some form of gender recognition certificate or change of sex, but only one of them, Argentina, allows mixing of male prisoners in the female estate.
Yeah, we want to try to hear from Argentinian activists as much as possible, because we feel like it was the first country and there's a lot of pressure on people there to just shut up really and accept the new order. So yeah, it's difficult with the language barrier, but we do want to try and you know, build relationships with those activists. GEARÓID, thank you so much for joining us. An absolute pleasure. Gur míle mágad.